Good morning, class, and good afternoon, sixth period. As you can see, I am not here physically today, but I thought that I would come and join you by video. You're in good hands today with Ms. Sudnick, who is going to be subbing for me today. But I wanted to use this opportunity to try out creating a video to explain the activity that you're going to be doing in class. So we're going to give that a try today. You can see that we have listed on the screen the learning target, which is I can compare and contrast ionic and covalent bonding, which is the next step in our understanding of how atoms form molecules. We've been looking at ionic bonding and covalent bonding, and what we want to do today is pull them together and be able to see how they're the same and how they're different. So we'll be using what's called a concept comparison or concept table. Pull that up here. Ms. Sudnick has passed that out. And what I want you to do is as I type information on the screen here, I want you to write the same thing on your table at your desk. So the first concept that we are going to be looking at is ionics. You can go ahead and write that in. And then the concept over here is covalent, which I gather from the learning target that's what we'd be focusing on. And then the overall concept, which is up on top here, and looking at how these two are connected, the big picture is the types of bonding. And as I mentioned before, looking at connecting this to prior understanding of molecules. Okay, so what I'm going to have Ms. Sudnick do right now is pause the video, and what you're going to do, work on as a table and then share as a class, are a list of characteristics that you know about ionic bonding, and you're going to write those here, and then a list of covalent bond characteristics, and you will write that here. Once you are done with that, and Ms. Sudnick unpauses it, you can see the list that I've come up with, which may be what you have, and you may have more things listed than I do. Okay, so go ahead and pause it, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Okay, welcome back. As we look at these differences between ionic and covalent bonding, what I want you to take a look at is what I've listed here. And I know I have quite a few things in this box. Sorry, it's kind of small, but wanted to make sure that we got everything in that we need to for this. So if you look under ionic bond, one of the things that is important in knowing about ionic bonding is this idea of giving and taking of electrons. And the reason for that is so that the atom can become stable. And it goes back to that wanting to have a complete outer energy level. When the electrons either leave or join the atom, then they become ions. So that's the next thing listed here. They form when electrons move away and join atoms. And then looking at how the actual bond, then it's the opposite charges that attract to form the bond. I also wrote here that compound is different than the separate atoms that or elements that formed before. So this idea of there's a chemical change that takes place. And then as we learned from the lab that ionic bonds have a high melting point, and then this idea that they are ionized in water. And that's that simulation where, like example with sodium chloride, when it's added to or dissolved in water, the sodium and the chlorine ions actually separate, and then it allows for the liquid, in this case water, to conduct electricity. Covalent bonds, then looking at that list, it's the valence electrons are shared. Remember, we used kind of this symbol to show that they're shared. They bond to become stable. The electrons are attracted to the protons, so there is a level of opposite attracting here, but it's not as strong of an attraction as with the ions. And then the compound is different than the individual elements, and covalent bonds tend to have low melting points, meaning that they melt at lower temperatures, and they do not ionize water. So those are some of the characteristics for covalent bonding. Now, If you have some of these, great. If you're missing some of them, please add them to your chart at this time. Okay, I'm going to explain the next step, and then Ms. Sudnick is going to pause the video for that. Now that you have a list of the characteristics, what I want you to do is to categorize them by the things that they have in common and the things that they do not have in common. So obviously, in looking at this table, you put the like characteristics here, and then you separate the unlike characteristics there. So go ahead, pause the video, and work on that as a group, and then I'll tell you what the next step is. Okay, great job. Now, the next step is to look at these lists of like characteristics. If we were to make a larger category for these characteristics, what would they be? And so I'm going to actually talk you through that and give you my ideas. And if you have different ideas, or Ms. Sudnick has different ideas, that would work as well. But one of the things that you see as a common characteristic between the two is that there is a certain level of opposite charges are involved. And that goes back to when you have protons and electrons, you're going to have different charges with that. Okay. The other thing is the idea of wanting to form molecules to have stability in the atoms, and it's to have that complete outer energy level, and that both of these involve a chemical change. And that goes to the compound is different than the individual elements that make up the bond. Okay, and if we look at then the unlike categories, what we want to take a look at here is what happens to the electrons. Okay, and then the other thing related to that is that this idea of chemical and physical. Is that here? Smaller physical and chemical properties. So we can figure out that those are some of the differences in terms of unlike category. So as I said, if you come up with different categories, that's fine, but these are some of the things that I was thinking of as I was looking at this table. Okay, the next step, and what is kind of wanting to tie this together with this chart, is looking at the summary at the bottom here. I've given you a sentence starter to get started with this, but you want to write one or two sentences related to this. So you'd want to start it with ionic bonds are similar to covalent bonds in that, okay, and then you want to list what the similarities are, okay, and you want to tie in this idea of the unlike categories and then give specific examples from that. And then the ionic bonds are different than covalent bonds in that are there, put that in there, are different than covalent bonds in that. And then you want to mention these unlike categories and then give specific examples related to that. So it really, the summary statement helps to bring it down into kind of a nice summary that is to the point and kind of expresses the differences and similarities between the two. So go ahead and work on that. Ms. Sudnick can walk around and help you with that, and then I'll explain what the next activity is. Okay, now that you have written your summary and you've talked about that, on the back of the paper, you have some choices that you can do. One of them is to write a poem. You can create a cartoon, draw a diagram, or write a story that demonstrates your understanding of the differences and similarities between ionic and covalent bonds. So that will be something that you need to work on once you have completed the other parts of this table. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you back at school on Monday.